Greetings. Dr. Peter Tittman is with the Woody Biomass Utilization Group at UC Berkeley. Peter's primary research interest is in the development of methods for utilizing geospatial data to efficiently manage and evaluate forests and to model forest-based industrial systems, energy, fuels, and wood products. With that, Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here and to be recording this for the Fire and Ecosystem Forest Management Water Yield Symposium. I've been asked to talk about markets for forest management residuals, and I'll cover some higher level conceptual issues around markets in general and how markets relate to forest management and decision making around forest management. And then I'll go into some existing and near-term market opportunities around residuals from forest management and forest products in general. I just described for you the program here. So I'm going to jump through this slide. So at a higher level, I wanted to talk for a moment about the correspondence between values and markets. The motivation to manage forests can be is related to the values that we have as a society for how forests should be and what they should be used for. The role that markets have in forest management is that markets can be seen to reflect shared values around forest products, forests as an entity unto themselves, and perhaps the services that forests provide to society: water, clean air, risk mitigation, those types of things. And I think it's important to reflect on the status of markets relative to the management strategies or management actions that we implement or would like to implement. Often there are markets, or often there aren't markets for the product of management. And I think that can reflect sort of broadly two situations. One in which the management objectives really aren't broadly held values. They don't reflect society's values in forests. So we may, as a manager or as a scientist, we may have certain values for how we'd like forests to look, what characteristics we'd like them to have from an ecosystem health standpoint. But really, when there are no markets to support management in that direction, it could be that those values, that value that the manager or the scientist has, really isn't as broadly held in society to actually affect that kind of management. And the other possibility is that the management outcome hasn't really been sufficiently monetized. A lot of times, well, forests are complex systems, and they are multifaceted in their production of values that society utilizes. And it's often challenging to actually monetize those, water being a simple example, the intrinsic value of forests as wilderness or as some more perhaps spiritual value that society might hold are very difficult to monetize. And it may be that there's a need to implement a policy or work towards policy that can actually reflect those values. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on specific sort of values that might drive or that seem to be driving forest management on public and private lands right now, and some of the challenges with markets around them. Biodiversity and ecosystem health. This is a value that could be characterized as the perception of the intrinsic value of forests of forest ecosystems apart from what we derive materially from forests. Um, so just the idea that the forest is healthy and the ecosystem is intact um, uh, is a value that I think influences how policy is generated in the state and how management actually makes decisions on public and private lands. Market signals around these values are generally fairly weak. There's very little in the way of a market signal to value this intrinsic nature of this intrinsic value of a healthy forest ecosystem. The advocates have a difficult time articulating or agreeing upon specific goals and outcomes and quantifying those things. However, politically, it's a fairly strong message and a strong value, particularly, I think, in California, where we have a very increasingly urban population that's somewhat more and more disconnected with the means of production of the goods that we consume, and more holds dear the idea of an ecosystem that is untouched or at least undestroyed by the needs of society. Forest products, kind of a different value driving forest management. Forest products means wood, being able to extract wood from forests that is of sufficient quality to produce things which have economic value. That would be furniture, paper, fiber, structural lumber. Those are things where we have a fairly strong market signal. Californians use a great deal of wood, and we have increasing standards for building efficiency that will likely mean that more wood is used in construction in the state. The political strength behind those values is really relatively weak. I think there's a public perception of that's a legacy of over-harvesting in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the forest products industry has a relatively weak voice politically in California's economy. Ecosystem services, I mentioned this briefly. Forest management drivers that are oriented towards ecosystem services would be those that increase the water yield, the water quality, improve water quality, and there's been efforts to monetize those values, to produce, to attribute a economic value to clean water, to clean air, such that these there is actually a market signal that would motivate management and facilitate management in the direction of providing these services. Unfortunately, as compelling the theory is of ecosystem services, there's been very little in the way of praxis in the sense that we don't have strong markets for ecosystem services, and it's difficult in many cases to actually quantify to agree upon a value that for these services that are provided by forests. The political strength, I would say, also is somewhat strong, similarly to kind of the intrinsic values of forests. It's an appealing idea to put a market, to kind of impose a market on these services, but in many cases, politically, it implies fundamental changes to the economics of some of the basic services in the state, predominantly water, and changing the economics around those basic services is perhaps prohibitively challenging politically. Another value driving forest management, I think, on public lands primarily is an institutional stewardship, or the momentum behind public agencies and the paradigms of management on public lands that have been in place for many years. And I think fire suppression is among the most representative of this type of value. And the market signal for this, you could say, is very strong, despite there being no sort of quote-unquote free market around that type of management. The public investment in wildfire suppression continues to increase, and public support for funding wildfire suppression and protection of private land from wildfire is kind of bar none. There's very little opposition to increasing public expenditure and meeting the perceived need to implement fire suppression and use federal budget in that direction as opposed to other directions on public land. So navigating markets is challenging from a management standpoint. They can facilitate the flow of capital of forestry projects if there is a correspondence between public values and the management objectives. Markets for residuals it's unlikely that they will pay the full cost to achieve a management objective. On industrial forest land, the management is primarily focused on producing a saw log. We don't call that a residual of forest management. We call that the primary commodity resulting from the management. So while markets for residuals for biomass may help offset some of the costs, it's unlikely that residuals will actually pay the full cost of the management to achieve the desired management objective. And I believe it's the job of policymakers to ensure that the outcome, not just the residual, has a market, and that can be achieved through public investment, direct investment supporting forest management activities, and additionally through structured markets like the cap and trade program in AB 32. And it's important, I think, for managers and those of us in the forestry community to recognize that all the values that we hold in forests are not necessarily widely held, and some outcomes that we might desire from a management perspective don't have broad public support, and reconciling that is an important part of moving forward with broader pace and scale of forest management. So focusing on some specific markets, the market for solid wood, saw logs produced from forest management activities processed into lumber. If you're considering producing saw logs, or if saw logs are a component of your management strategy, particularly in areas where you're doing pre-commercial or thinning or a restoration thinning, understanding what the market constraint is on minimum and maximum sizes is an important consideration. The market for raw logs for export is around $110 per cubic meter from the West Coast to China. That's in this last calendar year. That's an approximation. And at the mill on the West Coast, around $100 per cubic meter on the West Coast. Important to recognize that saw logs can generate additional revenue, which can be reinvested in management activities that don't have a direct revenue return in many cases on public lands. The timber sales help finance additional restoration or other types of activities that don't have an economic return. Firewood is also a fairly stable market for residuals from forest management. However, the market is fairly small and somewhat polarized between small operators serving local markets at $200 to $500 a ton retail to large distributors marketing smaller volumes in retail outlets, retail grocery outlets. And there's a fairly high value there, but the handling, processing, and packaging costs can substantially affect the economics of marketing firewood. Chipped and ground material, what a lot of us refer to as biomass, containing bark, foliage, a range of residuals and perhaps mineral materials. The primary or perhaps only market for those materials would be energy and landscaping, both of which are very challenging markets to meet when the cost of harvest and transport is accounted in the production costs. So clean chips potentially have value in pulp and paper, although there is very little infrastructure on the West Coast, none in California for producing pulp and paper. Wood pellets, however, there's an expanding market internationally for wood pellets, and there are a few early stage projects for developing new pellet mills in California. Currently, there are 2 that actually produce pellets for the domestic market. This is a chart reflecting the production costs and market value of a range of products from forest management. I'm not going to go into detail with each one, but if you look at the horizontal axis, negative numbers, the bars to the going in the negative direction from 0 reflect harvesting and processing costs, transportation, and conversion costs. And the values on the right reflect the market value of those products sold into existing markets. So you can see that some of these products, logs for export, heat or steam where there is no natural gas, potentially liquid fuels, and pulp for fiber, all clearly have a price signal that would drive forest management to produce that material. These numbers, I want to caveat this by saying these are estimates. They're very rough, and they're based on a very, very coarse survey. This information is very difficult to actually compile in a rigorous way. But I think this is a useful construct in considering what markets are available and what the production cost of these residuals might be. Some strategies and opportunities for accessing and creating markets around residuals. In the energy production sector, it's very difficult for electricity to be produced at a cost comparable with other renewables. Wind, solar, all have cost advantages over wood. Senate Bill 1122 was some legislation that is intended to create an incentive, a price incentive for building small, less than 3 megawatt biomass to electricity facilities. The intent is that the program will begin by paying a least cost of electricity. So that's a technical cost of production. And hopefully by making that initial investment, which is much higher than many other renewable electricity generation can be produced for, that the price signal will create a sustained development of the industry and innovation so that those costs can come down. The scale of impact of that program, however, at 50 megawatts, a total of 30 to 50,000 acres a year treated, is really a drop in the bucket compared to what many say is necessary on public and private lands to achieve the kind of stability in carbon stocks and fire risk reduction that's necessary in light of climate change. Integrated production is also an important characteristic or an important opportunity. Because the economies of scale affect the production cost at small scale. So producing electricity at small scales is much more expensive per kilowatt than it is at larger scales. It's important to be able to utilize the heat from production at small scale to achieve an economic viability for the project. And that means co-locating facilities with heat users. That could be dry kilns, brewing, agricultural processing, food processing, those types of opportunities. So with that, I'll finish up. My contact information is here. Feel free to give a call, send an email, or follow our feeds on the web at our website, or through Twitter at UCB Wood Products. Thanks very much.